Our first speaker is editor of the Intellectual Activist and TIADaily.com, and also serves as the political director for the Jefferson Area Tea Party. Please welcome Robert Tracinski.
Give me a moment here. I assumed I'd be the ninth speaker since I'm going to be talking about the Ninth Amendment. But in a way that's kind of fitting, because my view is, just get my notes up here. My view is that the Ninth Amendment, despite being perhaps the least cited and least paid attention to amendment of the Constitution, is in many ways the most important. The Ninth Amendment says, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Like I said, this is the least used and in many ways the least recognized amendment in the Bill of Rights, because and that's a shame, because in my view it's the most important. It's least understood because it's the most abstract rather than concrete, and because it's open-ended rather than particular. This is what makes it so important. While the other amendments are stated in legal terms, like the terms of a contract, the Ninth Amendment is stated in terms of political philosophy. It doesn't address the specific powers granted to the government or specific limitations on those powers. It names the principle behind those powers and those limitations, the principle of individual rights. The Ninth Amendment really is the spirit of the Constitution. It's about how to understand and interpret all the other provisions of the Constitution. Now, it would be no surprise to find that the Ninth Amendment is generally denied and disparaged by both the left and the right. Now, on the right, Robert Bork famously described the Ninth Amendment as an ink blot. Its meaning is so inscrutable and so impossible to understand that it might as well not be there, and is basically of no use for constitutional interpretation. Now, what Bork is missing is the Ninth Amendment is clearly an invitation to appeal to political philosophy by saying that there are other rights, non-enumerated rights that are retained by the people. It invites us to ask, what are those rights? And how do we know what those rights are? Now the left, for its matter, on its side, and this is what Bork is responding to, the left says, we have plenty of theories about what kind of rights we have. We have a right to health care, we have a right to this, to that, the other thing. I want to address the signs this fellow's holding over here. That's another example of the same thing. That they want to basically come up with as many rights as possible as they can and say these are the, and so by allowing them to appeal to political philosophy, it seems as if you're opening up to a subjective expansion of the concept of individual rights to mean anything. But it's not subjective, and it doesn't appeal just to any philosophy. The Ninth Amendment is an appeal, by talking about the rights retained by the people, is clearly an appeal to the political philosophy that would have been understood and accepted by the Founding Fathers. The political philosophy that's stated in the Declaration of Independence. The idea that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to preserve these rights, governments are instituted among men. There's a whole theory behind that, the whole theory of John Locke, the theory of individual rights that came to age in the Enlightenment, and that is what they are meaning to appeal to in the Ninth Amendment, and to bring into the Bill of Rights as a protection, again, as an open-ended protection against all future incursions on those rights, and not just the ones that you think of as the top dangers to name in the Bill of Rights. And I said the left disparages this too. The hearings recently for Elena Kagan, who was recent justice in the Supreme Court, she was actually asked by a senator, what about this idea of natural rights, that we have rights that predate the Constitution, that are simply recognized in the Constitution but not created by the Constitution? And she dodged the question. She refused to affirm the idea that we have natural rights. And she said, well, I have to stick to just what's, I have my own personal views, but I have to stick with just what's in the Constitution. And the Ninth Amendment gives the lie to that claim, because the idea of natural rights that exist prior to the Constitution is in the Constitution. It's there in the Ninth Amendment. And that's why the founder put it there. So the Ninth Amendment tells us affirming natural rights is sticking to the Constitution. It establishes the Lockean theory of individual rights and the idea of government being subservient to individual rights. It establishes that, in effect, as the official political philosophy of the United States government. And it also establishes as the official way, the most powerful way, most valid way to interpret all aspects of the Constitution. Now, the most important part about this is like I said, it's a very general, abstract statement. It's not a specific thing saying you can't ban free speech. It's a very concrete statement. This one is broad, applies to everything, and it mostly is manifesting a general attitude towards government and the role of government. It basically says that when the people approach their government, the rule for them is not that which is not permitted is forbidden. And it's the idea that if the government doesn't specifically allow you to do something, then you're not allowed to do it. They're the opposite. That's the rule for the government. For the government, that which is not permitted is forbidden. That which is not specifically enumerated as a power of government is forbidden. But for the American people, it goes the other way. Anything that the government is not specifically allowed to do to control your actions, you are assumed, the default is that you are assumed to be able to do that. The default assumption for the individual is you have freedom of action. And only if we specifically gave the government a power to control that, only then can the government act. So the idea is that for the government, the default is limitation of its power. For the individual, the default is freedom of your action. The Ninth Amendment, like I said, has been ignored, but it's still alive today in the mind of anyone who understands that simple relationship. I'm just going to end with one recent example. What was good about the recent healthcare ruling, the ruling that struck down the individual mandate in Obamacare as unconstitutional. What was good about it was the way the judge put it. He said basically, as long as there's nothing in the Constitution that the usual attitude that a politician has is, as long as there's nothing in the Constitution explicitly preventing me from doing something, from passing a law, I'm going to do it and try to stop it. The real rule ought to be, as if there's not as power specifically allowing you to do it, then you can't do it. And that's the attitude the judge in that case took. He said, quote, a thorough survey of pertinent constitutional case law yielded no reported decision from any federal appellate courts extending the Commerce Clause or the General Welfare Clause to encompass regulations of a person's decision not to purchase a product. So he's basically saying, I looked through all the law, all the case law, I looked through the Constitution, I looked through all the accepted interpretations of the Constitution. I didn't find anything saying you can do this, so therefore you can't. That's the right attitude to have to interpret the Constitution. That's the Ninth Amendment attitude. So I'm going to end with the idea that the Constitution is more than just a summary of specific provisions saying you can do this, you can't do that. Behind the Constitution, there is a principle. There is what I call a constitutional creed. And the constitutional creed is specifically this idea of individual rights and government subservient to individual rights and therefore limited in its power. The Ninth Amendment is the spirit of the Constitution. It is the statement of that constitutional creed. And that's why I think, in my view, it is the one that gives life to so much else that's in the Constitution.